Hello and welcome to the third video on VLANs. This one is going to focus on VLAN implementation and look a little bit at what are the normal and extended range of VLANs and get into the actual configuration we would do in the Cisco command line. So the first thing we want to do is we want to look at what is the normal range of VLANs on a 2960 switch. Where are we often going to be configuring our VLANs? So if we go on our 2960 switch and we're into the command line option, we are going to go ahead and show VLAN brief. So this gives us a little brief of the VLANs. It's one of those table displays, so as always, I'm going to say extend it until it looks like a readable table. So we'll notice that there is 1,005 VLANs sort of listed here. Obviously 2 through 1,001 are not showing up, but we have the default VLAN, which is number 1, and every single port is set active to it. Remember we talked about how by default the native VLAN is also VLAN 1, so we need to make sure we're reconfiguring things. Then we have 1002, 1003, 1004, 1005, which are FDDI and token ring defaults set aside. So those are reserved VLANs that we are not going to be using in this course. They're auto-created and they cannot be removed, but we don't need to really worry about them. The addresses we're mostly going to be worrying about are in the normal range. So from 1 to 1005 are in the normal range, but realistically 1002 through 1005 are reserved. So we're going to be working with anything from 1 to 1001. So if we're looking at normal addresses that we just talked about, we have the range from 0 to 1005. We have 0, 1002 to 1005 are reserved. Okay, so we can't touch those addresses at all. The reason this is because, and you'll only ever see 4096 on a 2960 or a 3560 switch, is because there's 12 bits, there's 12 bits dedicated to the VLAN ID. So 12 bits for VLAN ID in the 802.1 IEEE 802.1Q standard. So if you were to actually look up that standard and read it, you would see what the reserved bits were dedicated for. But the point here is that there's 12 possible bits, with 0 or 1 being the state for each possible bit. So 2 states per bit at 2 to the 12 gives us 4096. So that means we have the addresses we should have the addresses from 0 through 4095. So we've said the normal range is this range up to 1005. So what do we do with the rest of them? So from 1006 to 4094, we call these the extended range of VLAN IDs. I will just quickly go over to my reserved list and add that 4095 is reserved for virtual guest tagging. You don't need to look into that very much. If you're curious about it, you can Google VLAN 4095, and I think Yellow Brick has a good article on it. But that'll kind of give you, so the ones we can use in the extended range are from 1006 to 4094. So there's a few differences between normal and extended range VLAN IDs. So the normal range are the ones we use all the time. They're for small to medium-sized networks. They're stored in VLAN.dat, and this is a big one for us because when we ever want to reset our VLANs, we can just go into flash memory and delete VLAN.dat. If we're looking at the extended range, they're actually stored elsewhere. So they are stored in the running config file, which means if you don't delete them, or if you don't copy your running config over to your starting config, they will delete at startup. Because VLAN.dat is stored in the flash memory, that won't happen. They will be stored there. So you can delete the VLAN.dat file in order to kind of reset all your VLANs. Running config. So there's a difference in how they're stored. They're also aimed to allow ISPs essentially to extend infrastructure. So we're looking at a larger scope than small networks. We're not really going to see them very often, and realistically, when you think about it, we have all these VLANs, but we have a maximum of 24 fast Ethernet ports on a switch. So what are we can really only connect 24 VLANs, because then every port is on its own VLAN. So when we get to that stage and we start thinking about it, the reason that we have all this huge number up to like 4,095 is that we can actually start putting VLANs in a series. Or sorry, putting switches in a series so that we have like a switch rack with a series all connected together, and then we separate the VLANs on them. That kind of increases our number of ports, but not hugely. So yeah, there's fewer features on the extended range. It really is just an extension for when it's needed. The normal range is where we want to stay if we want all of the benefit of all of the benefits of a VLAN that are set up by default. For example, the normal range VLANs can be configured on trunking. Configured on trunks, but this cannot. So extended range cannot be on trunks. So that's pretty limiting in itself, especially as you're going to see for what we're doing. So that's kind of a look at the VLAN range information and the normal versus extended range. We really are going to work heavily in the normal range, and you'll see that we're not even using all the values in there. We're usually jumping by 5s or 10s because we're only really using 24 ports, so we don't really need to have more than 24 available. So for reference, this is what they're explaining. This is where they're explaining that on the actual course itself, and then where they start to get into creating a VLAN. So we're going to also get into creating a VLAN, and we're going to do that right in Packet Tracer. So I've set up a little scenario here where I have 2 switches and 4 PCs. I'm going to put PC0 and PC2 on the same VLAN, and I'm going to put PC1 and PC3 on the same VLAN. So what that means is this will be one VLAN, and then these 2 PCs will be one VLAN. And we're going to need to configure that on the PCs themselves, as well as on the on the switches. So what I'm going to do is I've created sort of an IP address table for these devices, and I'm going to set those up. We haven't yet created the VLANs on the switch. As we can see here, we still have the same VLAN. So the first thing we need to do is actually go and configure the VLANs on the switch. So the first thing to do is create the VLAN. So what we need to do is we need to be in global configuration mode. So configure terminal. And from global configuration mode, we're just going to use the command VLAN, and then we're going to type in the ID of the VLAN. So in this case, we're going to call this VLAN 10. So I'm going to do VLAN 10. If I wanted to give this VLAN a name, say VLAN 10 is going to represent the students in our network. So I'm going to do name students. Once I've set that up, I'm going to say end so that I exit out of that VLAN. And now I'm going to go ahead and run that show VLAN brief once more. And we can now see that there is a VLAN 10 called students that's active. There's no ports assigned to it yet, but it exists and it has a name. So we're going to go ahead. We're going to go ahead and we are going to create a second VLAN. So once again, from global configuration mode, we're now going to create our staff VLAN. So we're going to start with VLAN ID. Our staff VLAN will be 20. We're going to do name staff. I'm going to spell staff right. Once we've set the name, we can end out of there. And once again, to view our progress, we're going to show that VLAN brief and see, okay, we have VLAN 10 is students, VLAN 20 is staff. So this is starting to look pretty good, but we need to set it up on the other switch as well. So very quickly on switch 2, I'm going to go to command line. I'm going to enable into privilege exec mode. I'm going to configure terminal into global configuration mode. And then in global configuration mode, I'm going to set up VLAN 10 to be the student VLAN. Oh, I can't remember if I use students or I think I use students. And I'm going to set up VLAN 20 to be the staff VLAN. And I'm just going to quickly go back and check that show VLAN brief returns the same value. So 10 is students, 20 is staff. If I open the other window, we should be able to compare these two and see that they're both students, staff, VLAN 10, VLAN 20, perfect. It's really by the VLAN ID that things are, but it's nice to keep the names the same and nice and consistent as we go through. So that's how you actually create the VLAN, but we haven't set anybody up on the VLAN yet. We need to assign ports to the VLAN. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go on switch 1. I'm just going to minimize switch 2 for a second here. And on switch 1, I'm once again going to go into global configuration mode via configure terminal. From configure terminal, I'm going to go on to the interface itself. Now, what interface am I going on? I'm going to configure PC0. So if I hover over switch, we can see that F01, F01, F02, and F03 are up. And in fact, F01 is the one that connects the two switches. F02 goes to PC0, and F03 goes to PC1, which I know because I set it up. So I'm going to go on to F02 at this time, so F0/2. And on interface 02, I'm going to set the switch port mode to access. So switch port mode access. Switch port mode access is configuring it, meaning there is a host device connecting to the switch via this port, and it needs to be able to access the switch port in that way. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to say switch port mode access VLAN. What this is doing is it's switch port access VLAN ID. So switch port access. We don't need to set the mode this time because it's already in mode access. And we're just going to say which VLANs are accessing it. So in this case, we know VLAN 10, that student's VLAN, will be accessing this port. This is important because VLAN mode access means this is a host device, and switch port mode trunk would mean we're connecting to another intermediary device. So we're not looking at that right now, but it is something to be aware of. Okay, so I'm just going to exit off this one and very quickly set up interface F03, because I know that's PC1 and it's going to be on the other VLAN. So I'm once again going to first set the switch port mode to access. And once I've set the switch port mode, I can go switch port access VLAN 20. Note that if you haven't set it to access, you're going to have a lot of issues there. So I'm going to end back to the beginning just so I can now show you what that show VLAN brief looks like. So if we look at the show VLAN brief now and extend it out so it looks like a table, you can see that FA02 is assigned to students and FA03 is assigned to staff. All of the other ports are active, but they are assigned to the default VLAN. So that's essentially what we just set up. So I'm very quickly going to go through that again on switch 2 so you can see what we're doing. So first, we go into global configuration mode using config T. And if you think you know this is a good point to pause the video, try it yourself, and then play the video and see what happens. So in global configuration mode, what we're going to do is we are going to once again go onto the interface. So interface F02. On that interface, I'm going to set the switch port mode to access. I'm going to spell mode right, to access. Once I've set that, I can do switch port access VLAN 10. I'm going to exit back one. Now I'm going to go into interface F03. From there, I'm going to turn on the switch port mode to access. From there, I can go to switch port access and give access to VLAN 20. I'm going to spell switch port correctly though. And then I'm going to end back to the beginning and once again view that show VLAN brief. So if we're looking at show VLAN brief, we can quickly check 2 is for students, 3 is for staff. And I didn't actually hover over here, but I'm pretty sure that's how I set it up. Yeah, so we're good to go here. We've set up our access ports for our switches, which is a good place to be. You can, if you're doing multiple ports to a single VLAN, go on to an interface range using the interface range command. That's up to you, really, but it's something to be aware of. Okay, So now that we've set up those ports so that those work, if we want to remove a VLAN assignment, so let's say we actually configured it on the wrong port. So let's say, I'm just going to go ahead and configure something incorrectly. So let's say I had gone into config T and I want to remove that F02 off of student 10. What I can do is I can go straight into configuration terminal, so I'm in global configuration mode. I can go back onto that interface, F02, and then pretty much like always, you're going to use the exact same command, but with a no in the front. So what we're going to do is we're going to say no switch port access VLAN, and then we can end. And now if we view that briefing table, we can see it F02 is no longer on there. So we do want it on there. So for the purposes of this, I'm going to go put it back on there real quick. VLAN 20, and then I'm going to end. And now when we show VLAN, hopefully it's back to where we had it originally and how we want it to look. So we can see that 2 is on the students network and 3 is on the staff network, and we're perfectly set up here, which is basically all we wanted. We just went about it in a complicated way. Okay, so we're looking at our file here and we're saying, okay, what if I want to delete a whole bunch of VLANs? I want to delete my whole VLAN setup and start over because everything is terrible. So the command we're going to do is in privileged exec mode, which means we're right back at switch hashtag there. And what we're going to do is we're going to type the command delete, and then we're going to go to the memory location, so /vlan.dat. We hit enter, we confirm once more, and it will delete that file. Now, I had previously deleted this to making this video, so that's why the file is deleted, but for you, it should remove the file. So what's going to happen now is if we do show VLAN brief, the VLANs are still there. And we're like, well, what the heck is happening? What's happening is that once you delete that, we must use, we must go ahead and restart the switch. Okay, so we can then call a reboot, and the device will reboot, or it won't because it's not reboot. 1 second, Control-Shift-6, oops. Control-Shift-6 to kill a command. Let me just check what it is here. Reload, sorry. So we're gonna reload. It wants to save the modified configuration. I'm gonna say no. Proceed with reload, yes. Reloads the whole thing. And at this point, we'll see that the flash memory no longer contains the vlan.dat. So it's not going to load it. Okay, so enable, we're in a privileged exec mode, we're going to show VLAN brief, and you'll see that it's gone. So what we've done is we've set up VLANs, we've configured them for interfaces, we've removed them from individual interfaces, and we've also looked at how to delete the whole vlan.dat file. Not deleting the whole vlan.dat file really crucially requires that reboot sequence. So you can create a VLAN, you can name a VLAN, you can set up a port to be an access port. You can set up a switch port to then be assigned to specific VLANs. You can remove specific VLANs from a switch port, or you can remove all VLANs from a switch port. And you also know how to delete the whole VLAN setup stored in the normal range. Because remember, only normal range addresses are in vlan.dat. Everything else is in your running configuration, but that's outside the scope of this course. We're only really going to be working with these VLANs that fall in this range from 1 to 1002. So I hope that clarifies a little bit about configuring VLANs. The next video is going to be on Vlan Trunking. And so you'll notice that we only touched these ports that face host devices. We didn't touch any of the ports that face between intermediary devices. So in this case, every VLAN exists on a single cable, and that's fine. That's easy to do. The switch knows that that port is on that VLAN and that port's on that VLAN. The tricky part here is that there's only one cable between the two switches that must pass two VLANs. So we'll look at how that works, and we talked a little bit about VLAN tag IDing and trunking, but we're going to look at how we actually configure it. So that's the end of this video. Hope you enjoyed.